Please be seated. We will now resume our session, and before I hand the floor over to the co-prosecutors, I would like to remind all the parties to the proceeding through our email on the 14th of October 2013. All witnesses, civil parties and experts who have testified before this chamber in case 002/01, their names can be used in your closing statements. As for other individuals who have not yet appeared before this chamber or who will be testified in the near future, please use their pseudonyms only and not their real names. The floor is now given to the National Co-Prosecutor. You may proceed. Chile. Good morning, Your Honors, and good morning everyone in and around the courtroom. My colleague William Smith and I will make our closing statements for case 002/01. During our closing statements presentation, at some point we will make on the screen some video clips, some text, as well as some photos. This trial is about the criminal responsibility of Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan for crimes that shocked the conscience of humanity. In the next 3 days, I and my colleague will outline how the evidence in this case has proven that Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan each played a unique and critical role in a criminal enterprise that persecuted, tortured, and killed their fellow Cambodians. Millions of innocent civilians, including women, children, the elderly, and most vulnerable. Even today, countless Cambodian families carry a heavy burden from the 4-year period that the Khmer Rouge ruled Cambodia. Memories of mistreatment, starvation, and torture of loved ones lost, who were killed or simply disappeared. The nation still suffers from lost opportunities for education and development. A generation of the most educated and skilled Cambodians was almost wiped out, killed, or forced to flee the country. The effects are still felt today. This trial is important for Cambodia, but not just Cambodia. It is important for the entire world. It demonstrates that crimes of such magnitude and severity will not be forgotten. and that those responsible will be held to account. The United Nations and the Royal Government of Cambodia joined together to build this court, to bring life to justice, to bring justice to life, and to make justice relevant and accessible for all. Of course, in accordance with Your Honor's severance order, you will determine the guilt or innocence of the accused in this first phase of the trial on only a portion of the crimes of the indictment and the crimes of that regime. In this first portion of the trial, we are addressing the crimes associated with the forcible evacuation of the cities and towns of Cambodia following the Khmer Rouge's victory on 17 April 1975, crimes associated with subsequent forcible transfers of populations between rural areas, principally to the north and northwest, later in 1975 and 1976, and the mass execution of former Lunol soldiers at Tu Pu Chre in April 1975. But even these limited sections of the indictment include widespread crimes against humanity affecting millions of victims, including forcible transfers, persecutions, enforced disappearances, murder, and exterminations. Moreover, the evidence that has been presented in this phase of the trial has shown that the crimes committed were the result of criminal policies and in furtherance of a criminal plan that preceded and extended throughout the period of the Democratic Kampuchea regime. The accused Khieu Samphan, Nuon Chea, and the rest of the most senior leadership of the regime formulated and furthered the plan and these policies, knowing these crimes would result. What happened is what they planned. In order to understand the accused's knowledge and intent, and the genesis of the criminal plan and policies, we must go back and examine some of the history of the Khmer Rouge and the role of these accused, Khieu Samphan and Nuon Chea. The case before you is one of the most factually complex criminal cases ever prosecuted. The judgment in this case will require an analysis of a vast body of evidence that shows the development of a criminal plan over a period of many years. However, even in the most complex of cases, criminal intent and criminal acts can be demonstrated by a small number of key events. In this case, those key events are the following. A meeting of the CPK Party Center in June 1974, at which the leaders of the party, including these accused, decided collectively to evacuate by force the city of Phnom Penh and every other urban center. A meeting of the battlefield committees in early April 1975, at which the leaders, again including these accused, affirmed that decision and issued orders to the military to ensure the evacuation of Phnom Penh. A series of decisions by the party leaders to execute captured military officers and officials of the Khmer Republic regime, including a decision publicly communicated by the Second National Congress on 26 February 1975, and decisions of the CPK Party Center in August and September 1975, forcibly to transfer more than 500,000 people to the north and northwest regions of the country. The question is whether these accused knew about them. These accused participated in and supported the above decisions. They decided to commit the crimes with which they are charged. They intended those crimes, and they ensured through their acts and authority that those crimes were committed. We submit that these acts alone are sufficient evidence to prove their guilt. But we have also put before you a mass of evidence from a multitude of sources, documentary and testimonial, which paints a detailed picture of the planning and execution of the crimes. That evidence proves that these crimes were not committed in an unexpected or rapid turn of events. The crimes were not coincidental. Instead, they were orchestrated and implemented with precision through a highly hierarchical, disciplined and organized force commanded by these accused. Let me say at the outset, Your Honors, that this case is not about communist ideology or about competing political ideas. Neither communism nor socialism nor any other political system or philosophy is on trial before this court. This is a case about violence, enslavement, and death on a mass scale. It is about crimes inflicted on the people of Cambodia, crimes that were committed by forces and cadres commanded by Nuon Chea, Khieu Samphan, and other leaders of the Communist Party of Cambodia. The evidence shows each and every crime committed by those forces was intended by these accused. Those crimes were integral to the common criminal plan which they devised and carried out. On 17 April 1975, Nuon Chea, Khieu Samphan and their co-perpetrators created the first slave state in the modern era. They ordered and orchestrated the emptying out of every city and urban center in Cambodia. They broke up homes and families and herded millions of evacuees into rural cooperatives, in which they were imprisoned, stripped of their most fundamental rights as human beings, subjected to psychological and physical abuse, and forced to live in appalling conditions. They ordered the complete abolition of an entire way of life, the closing down of schools, markets, and courts of law, the elimination of religion and property. They ordered and oversaw the systematic elimination of those groups whom they perceived as their enemies. That is the essence of the common plan that is described in the indictment. A plan that is steeped in criminal intent. This plan was criminal in its core, its purpose, its design, its methods, and its means. In 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, it caused the deaths of at least 1.7 million and as many as 2.2 million people, or a quarter of the Cambodia's population at the time. The crimes committed in pursuance of this plan devastated a country and its people. As I said at the start of this trial, no court could ever address every crime these accused are ultimately responsible for. This trial is therefore an attempt to provide justice for some of the victims by addressing certain important crimes. In this first trial in case 002, the accused are facing charges for crimes committed against hundreds of thousands of people in the course of true forced transfers of the population and the mass execution of the officials and officers of the fallen Khmer Republic regime at Tulpu Chirei. They are on trial for the crimes against humanity or murder, extermination, political persecution, enforced disappearance, and other inhumane acts through attacks on human dignity and forced transfer. This trial has also enabled the court to set these crimes in the broader context of the history, authority structures, and policies of the Communist Party of Cambodia. It has additionally examined the role of these accused in the regime they led, in addition to their responsibilities for the crimes included in this first trial. The Honours will recall that at the start of this trial, the accused welcomed these proceedings as an opportunity to set the record straight from their point of view, to put forward their version of the facts, and to answer the allegations against them before the court and before the people of Cambodia. During the trial, they gave limited testimony and confirmed that they would testify again before the close of the proceedings. Khieu Samphan said he wanted to hear all the evidence before answering questions from the prosecution. Then, in the final stages of this trial, as the evidence mounted against them, both accused reversed course. They chose not to subject themselves to questioning by the judges, the co-prosecutors, or counsel for the civil parties. They thus made a strategic decision to shield themselves from further scrutiny and incrimination. They chose not to continue testifying because they had no defense that would stand up to scrutiny. they have nevertheless elected to make additional statements that will not have been tested by judges and counsel. We anticipate that in those statements and in the statements of their counsel, Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan will seek refuge from criminal responsibility in a whole array of excuses. They will argue that they acted with the best of intentions, that all power was vested in only one man, Pol Pot, whom they supported, because they had no knowledge of the widespread terror being perpetrated under their collective orders, that they would have acted differently if they had known that such horrific atrocities were being committed by people under their joint command. In putting forward these excuses, they will embrace a template that has been adopted by every despot who has stood trial for committing mass crimes against his people. It was not my fault. Others are to blame. We also anticipate that in order to explain away the evidence that shows their direct personal contributions to the crimes, they will invoke historical injustices from Cambodia's colonial history to past wars and actions of Cambodian governments that preceded democratic Cambodia. They will put forward conspiracy theories about the intentions of neighboring countries. They will say that on 17 April 1975, they had no option but to act the way they did. As Nuon Chea did in his written brief, they will ask you to accept that evacuating the cities and subjecting the people of this country through a regime of enslavement and terror was lawful, reasonable, and necessary. As Nuon Chea claims in his brief, not only were their actions correct, they were ahead of their time. And they were extremely progressive. The evidence that has been put before this court lays bare the wholly untenable nature of these claims. Those claims amount to nothing more than demonstrable lies. The evidence you have heard over the course of this trial establishes that these accused were the architects, directors, supervisors, and willing participants in the crimes with which they are charged. These crimes were perpetrated under the watchful eye of a collective leadership in which these accused played key roles. The evidence shows that these accused acted willfully and with intent to commit the crimes. My colleague William Smith and I will present these closing submissions in three parts. Firstly, I will make submissions on the evidence relating to the crimes of the first and second forced transfers and the plan which led through their commission. My colleague will then present submissions on the criminal policy of killing Khmer Republic military and officials and the crimes at Tulpu Chey, and he will then make submissions on the responsibility of each accused, through their participation in and significant contributions to the common criminal plan. He will also deal with the responsibility of the accused for planning, ordering, aiding and abetting, and instigating these crimes, as well as for their failure as superiors to prevent the commission of the crimes or to punish the direct perpetrators. Finally, in the third part, I will make submissions regarding sentencing. The events which took place on 17 April 1975 were not isolated. They did not happen in a vacuum. They were a continuation of well-established CPK policies of forcibly evacuating captured urban areas, enslaving their residents, and killing members of the Khmer Republic regime and other perceived enemies. Evidence of these acts in the late 1960s and throughout the early 1970s is important. It is important because it proves that the events of April 1975 were part of a continuous system of violence, brutality, and oppression that the accused had created long before. That evidence proves that in agreeing to evacuate the cities upon victory, the accused knew that mass crimes would be committed. They knew it because they had done it before and seen the suffering that ensued. It is compelling evidence of their intention, their motive, their premeditation, and their state of mind. The policies of forced transfer and execution of targeted groups are linked in a key respect. They are both driven by the view of these accused that it is necessary to treat everybody who is outside the revolutionary ranks as a real or potential enemy. Aware of their own serious mistreatment of the population, virtually the entire population was viewed with suspicion and treated as enemies, particularly those from urban areas, those who were educated, those with connections abroad, members of ethnic minorities, those who practiced any religion, and especially those who had been in any way associated with the prior regime. Rather than seeking to win political support from the population, the paranoia of the DK leaders led them to coerce support through terrorizing all those who lived under their rule. Those whom they perceived to be against them were liable to suffer and to die. Violence was at the very core of everything they did. It defined how they came to power, how they exercised that power, and how they sought to enforce that power against those outside their ranks. This violence has its origins in the party's class struggle against its enemies. That struggle started from the party's inception in 1960. The party circular, that is the revolutionary flag, confirms that. At the party's first Congress in September 1960, the party leaders, including Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, and Ieng Sary, determined that there was a life and death contradiction between Cambodian peasants and the landowners. This marked the beginning of what they called the National Democratic Revolution. The concept of life and death contradictions was powerful and enduring. It was not just a philosophical abstract. It was a practical, hard-edged principle that was put into practice. At age 21, Kang Kek-Ev alias Dutch was responsible for the deaths of more than 12,000 people perceived by the party center as enemies. He is therefore a man very well qualified to explain what having a life and death contradiction meant. When he testified, he explained it in a very simple way. In the philosophy of the dialectical materialism, there were contradictions. The contradiction between us and our enemy is the life and death contradiction, which means that for one to prosper, the other one must die. Yet, despite this, the accused will argue that this was not a fight against people, but rather against a system of oppression. You must not be fooled by this lie. Thousands of people died as a result of the decision to use revolutionary violence long before April 1975. In order to carry out armed violence against their enemies, the party leaders set up the so-called secret defense units from 1961. These armed militias eventually grew into the Khmer Rouge Army. In his 2004 book, Khieu Sampon admitted that the functions of these units in the 1960s included killing people, caught spying on parties' meetings. In the countryside, aside from the developing peasant associations, the first self-defense units were taking shape. The local authorities' secret agents who were caught spying on important party meetings were sometimes tied up and physically eliminated. CPK's smashing of enemies was never limited to self-defense or to killings in the heat of battle. Party cadres and militias executed captured soldiers from the very beginning of CPK's rebellion against the regime of Norodom Sihanouk in 1968. Philip Short described the early instances of the implementation of this policy. He said, quote, "During that period, when prisoners were captured, if the soldier captured was a local person and was known, then he might be released unharmed. If he was not known, he would be killed. So there was a take no prisoners policy from the beginning." End of quote. Mr. Short was then asked if his research indicated that these killings were done under a written directive. He said the following, quote, "There was no written instruction. It was just what you did, what you knew you had to do, what you knew the party would want you to do. It was clearly understood to be the case." End of quote. By 1971, CPK's use of terror against those perceived enemy agents and spies became more systematic. The case file contains evidence of several security centers established in this period. Most directly, your honors have heard evidence of the establishment of Security Center M13 in July 1971 in Om Leang Commune in the CPK Special Zone. Kang Kek-il alias Dutch ran M13 from July 1971 until April 1975. In his testimony, he described how Khmer's military sent people suspected of being spies to this security center for interrogation and execution. He said, quote, "The people who were sent by the soldiers to M13 for interrogation and smash, they were part of the party's policies. No matter if they were poor or rich, they would be sent to M13, and they were accused as spies, and they were later to be smashed." End of quote. Thus, Dutch confirmed that prisoners at M13 were tortured and killed in accordance with party policy. These early crimes were not committed under the orders of local commanders, removed from the party center as the defense would have you believed. Dutch worked under the immediate supervision of von Wade, who was the secretary of the Special Zone and Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan's fellow member of the CPK Central Committee. Dutch said, quote, "Von Wade himself instructed me the way to torture those people. The best way he liked was to use a plastic bag to cover the heads of those people. He said, 'You, comrade, need to look at their neck and see if it's shaking or it's vibrating, or rather the pulse at the neck. If it was vibrating very strongly, they will be considered as spies.'" End of quote. This example demonstrates the absurd, twisted logic of the Khmer Rouge leaders. Their perceptions of enemies were grounded in a deep and abiding paranoia and with no basis in reality. They lived in a world of visceral, illogical, irrational hatred. A little later, Dutch, describing the methods of torture in more detail, said, quote, "At M13, we were allowed to first beat the prisoners, secondly, use the telephone, electric telephone as the method of torturing, and waterboarding and plastic bag to cover the detainee's face to suffocate them." End of quote. Dutch testified that the categories of enemies who were sent to M13 for interrogation and execution included captured Lunar soldiers, cadres who had been sent to study in Vietnam, and other people inside CPK ranks. This evidence proves systematic and organized use of extrajudicial executions by CPK cadres who were under the direct authority of the CPK Party Center. It is highly reliable because Dutch has not only proved himself to be a man of extraordinarily detailed memory, but also because at the time he gave this evidence, he had no motive to lie or to embellish. He was at that stage already convicted and sentenced by the Supreme Court chamber to life imprisonment. He had already admitted his own role in torturing and murdering innocent people at both M13 and S21. Dutch also confirms that the methods of interrogation and torture developed at M13, pursuant through instructions by the party leaders, were later used at S21 and other DK period security offices. Nuon Chea has himself admitted to the existence of CPK security centers before 1975. In his interviews with Ted Sambat, he described a security office called S39, which, according to him, was created by Pol Pot in 1971 to root out traitors and detect spies who had infiltrated their movement. According to Nuon Chea, S39 was charged with investigating and following suspected enemies. Captured Lunar soldiers were executed by Dutch. In 1972, TCW 349 was a villager in a liberated zone in Prey province, and his family were farmers. In his OCIJ statement, he described the killing of Khmer Republic officials in that year. He said, quote, at this same time, the sub-district chiefs and Lunar government officials were being killed. For example, the Swayanto sub-district chief, Pei Pen, and his children were killed. End of quote. In his testimony, Philip Short described an intensification of the CPK policy of killing those deemed to be enemies of the party. He confirmed his finding that from 1973, Khmer Rouge forces systematically disemboweled prisoners and executed suspected collaborators as well as deserters. His evidence is entirely consistent with a written instruction issued by the party center in the July 1973 revolutionary flag, which stated, quote, if the spies are arrested to be executed in the meeting before the people, some people may be frightened of us. They think that we are extremely cruel. The stance to smash the spies is correct, but it is inappropriately carried out. End of quote. In commenting on this instruction, Philip Shaw testified, saying that, quote, they dealt at various times with the question of how executions should be carried out and who had the authority to authorize executions. The guiding principle behind all of them was, executing people is right when they are counter-revolutionary, when they are against the revolution, but it must be done in a way which does not harm the revolution's goals. This is an example. You don't execute people in front of others, and that through the Khmer Rouge period was pretty general. End of quote. Yet another instance of organized and systematic elimination of perceived enemies in this period is the killing of hundreds of Khmer communist cadres who had returned to Cambodia from Vietnam, where For many years, they had received training in communist doctrine and remained devoted revolutionaries. When the communist movement in Cambodia strengthened in the early 1970s, they returned to Cambodia to have the revolution. Initially, they were given positions of authority within the CPK administration. However, from 1972, the CPK leadership ordered a purge of these people. Almost all of the Hanoi returnees were arrested and killed. Only a few survive. The basic reason for the decision to remove and kill them was that they were associated with Vietnam and therefore distracted by the CPK leaders. In a 1996 publication, Ieng Sari admitted the executions of some 2,000 Khmer returnees from Hanoi, using the only appropriate term, a massacre. You have heard evidence from a number of witnesses about the fate of this group. Witness Nu Mao was a sub-district cadre in the Udong district in 1973. He estimated that some 2,000 to 3,000 Khmer cadres had returned from Vietnam. He said, quote, and later on, the upper echelon asked that people at the base at all levels be gathered up so that they could attend study sessions. But these people would never return after attending such sessions. I presumed that they could have been disappeared or they could have died after these sessions. So again, I am still convinced that they all died. End of quote. Witness Chuk Ren, who was a platoon commander in the CPK Southwest Zone in 1973, also recalled the purge of the Khmer cadres returning from Hanoi in his testimony. Quote, during 1973, these people were the target for arrest. In Kampot province alone, I could say that these people who went to Vietnam during Isarat time, returned home at a later date, were arrested and they were regarded as the Khmer Hanoi citizens. The arrest did happen. End of quote. Stephen Hatter spoke to one of the people who helped carry out the purge in Sector 13 of the CPK Southwest Zone. This interview took place in 1980, shortly after the fall of the Democratic Cambodia regime. The interviewee said, quote, by early 1972, the Khmer from Hanoi were completely cleaned out. This process started with trying to break out the Khmers and the Vietnamese units. This had been the plan from the very beginning, but it was not implemented until early 1972. Our organization dealt with this problem in the following manner. We called those Khmers from Hanoi to come to study, and someone led them away. So really we were expelling them. When we began pulling them out, the others did not realize what was happening. And so we were able to get rid of almost all of them. Very few realized what was happening in time and escaped to Vietnam. End of quote. Philip Short undertook research into the fate of the Hanoi returnees. he found that they were executed under Pol Pot's orders. In court, he said, quote, "Many had married Vietnamese women. They were suspected of having a lot of sympathy for the Vietnamese. So, in 1973, relations between the CPK and the Vietnamese became more intense. The CPK needed the Vietnamese less because it was becoming stronger. Its forces were becoming stronger. The suspicion of the returnees increased, and they were packed in a camp and many killed." End of quote. In our submission, the evidence of the purge of the Khmer cadres returning from Hanoi is extremely important. It is yet another demonstration of the fact that years before 1975, Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan adopted a policy of extrajudicially executing those they perceived to be their enemies. This tragic episode also shows their criminal intent. The Khmer cadres from Hanoi were committed communists. They wanted to have the revolution. They were not accused or suspected of collaborating with imperialist, capitalist, or other so-called oppressive classes. Their only fault was their perceived association with another country. In the eyes of the CPK leadership, that was enough to condemn them to death. Khieu Samphan has admitted his knowledge of the removal of the Hanoi cadres in a book published in 2004. But he said that he did not know what happened to them. This is a blatant lie. Knowing the history and culture of the CPK, the consistent execution of perceived enemies, did he think that they had been sent on holiday? Khieu Samphan was a member of the party center throughout 1970 to 1975 period and was inseparable from Pol Pot and Nuon Chea. He took part in the deliberations and decisions on party policy at the highest level. By his own admission, he attended the 1971 Congress, at which the party determined that Vietnam is a friend with whom there is a contradiction. Khieu Samphan issued numerous statements endorsing the smashing of the party's enemy. But even taking his statement on its face, it contains an important admission. He knew that the Khmer cadres were pulled aside and did not disagree. There were also purges within the party itself. These purges were justified in the eyes of the leaders because party ranks had been infiltrated by enemy elements who were conducting pacification activities. In other words, party members who lacked revolutionary zeal were a target. This is confirmed in the February-March 1976 issues of the Revolutionary Flag. I would like to take your honors to the 1974 issues of the Revolutionary Youth magazine. This is a document addressed by the party leadership to members of the Revolutionary Youth League. In other words, the youth who had joined Khmer Rouge's ranks. This document acknowledges in ambiguous terms that the party was executing those who entered the liberated zones and were suspected of spying. It stated, quote, "They are arrested by our armed forces and people in the liberated zones and subsequently smashed dishonorably," end of quote. In another extract, this document confirms that even those suspected of entering the so-called liberated zones to take people with them were being killed by the local militia. The evidence I just quoted demonstrates that people who were suspected of spying or undermining the CPK in other ways were first captured and then smashed. They were not killed in the heat of battle. They were not put on trial, prosecuted, and sentenced. Instead, they were summarily executed. To use the words from the party circular, smashed dishonorably. This document also demonstrates that these killings in the liberated zones were official party policy endorsed from the very top of the leadership. It ties in perfectly with the evidence of actual executions at M13. The forced evacuations of the cities in April 1975 were themselves driven by Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan's determination that this was the only way to bring down the urban classes and to break up enemy networks in the cities. The identification and smashing of enemies went hand in hand with the use of violence against civilian populations who were forced into Khmer Rouge cooperatives. The cooperatives were introduced in 1971. In 1972, the CPKs introduced forced collectivization. By May 1973, the party was moving people into high-level cooperatives, where their rights were suppressed even more severely. Khieu Samphan has admitted in a recent interview that cooperatives were imposed on Cambodian people by force. Quote, There had to be coercion for a while, coercion to join cooperatives because nobody would voluntarily take part in cooperatives. There had to be coercion first. End of quote. The defense will argue that the establishment of cooperatives was part of a legitimate program directed at addressing social inequality and exploitation of peasants by the oppressive classes. But the manner in which the cooperatives actually operated belies this claim. From the resolution of the Central Committee in May 1972, collectivization was implemented by force. From that point forward, opposing the CPK programs in the liberated zones meant death. The real principal purpose of the cooperatives was to maintain the party leadership's grip on power by enslaving the civilian population. Prior to 1975, there was, contrary to the defense assertions, a CPK policy to kill both military and civil servants of the Khmer Republic. A witness said in an OCLJ statement at document E3/5636 that in 1974 he was the head of Khao Sema district office. He was therefore well placed to describe the operation of cooperatives in 1974 and the killings of ranking lunar officers, civil servants, and people who opposed the imposition of cooperatives. He said, quote, In 1974, people were brought into cooperatives and the killing started. Not many ordinary people were killed, only the former ranking soldiers of major or captain were killed. End of quote. Philip Shaw testified about the use of violence against ordinary people, which accompanied forced collectivization. Mr. Shaw said, quote, "There was an intensification. It was part of what we've been discussing. The fundamental reason was that the growth in Khmer forces had reached a point where it was no longer quite so necessary to win over the peasantry, to win over support by gentle means." End of quote. In his testimony, Stephen Heder confirmed an extract from his book on Cambodian communism, which deals with CPK's widespread use of violence and execution in the pre-1975 period. The extract stated that, quote, "In 1971 to 1972, much of the population remained cynical, distrustful, and fearful of a revolution that maintained its position through threats and executions. As the CPK expelled Vietnamese armed forces in 1972-1973, it replaced their military domination with increasingly extreme coercion to ensure peasant compliance with its demands. The CPK became even more violent and repressive after mid-1973, when it radicalized its policies." End of quote. We have put before you contemporaneous evidence of the brutality of the Khmer Rouge administration in the so-called liberated zones. A US cable confirms that in 1974, the Venerable Praku Ad, chief of Wat Tapoi, fled to Laos, where he was interviewed. The report states, quote, "According to the monk, he was able to flee from that area during the night, but during the day, a permanent surveillance was maintained. As to the military problem, it comes uniquely from Mr. Khieu Samphan's order, which forbade the population in the zone bordering Laos from respecting Prince Sihanouk. Those who do not obey this order are executed miserably." End of quote. The cooperatives were also used as a tool to attack and smash enemies, both those in the rural areas and those in the cities. A May 1976 CPK document entitled Third Anniversary of the Organization of the Peasant Cooperatives states, quote, "Through the peasant cooperatives, the party not only attacked and demolished the feudal landowner class, the party also attacked capitalists in cities and rich peasants in rural areas. Feudal landowners, rich peasants, and the like were attacked and smashed." End of quote. I will now address the evidence which establishes the criminal intent underlying the CPK's use of forced transfers. Here again, the evidence of criminal acts and motives before 1975 is crucial. These events were the precursors to the forced evacuation of Phnom Penh. As such, they show a consistent course of criminal conduct. As Professor Chandler testified, the repetitive pattern of the forced evacuations of towns before 1975 reached its climax in the evacuation of Phnom Penh. The evidence before the court establishes that the CPK practice of forcibly moving civilian populations out of urban areas and into areas controlled by revolutionary forces was adopted from the early 1970s onwards. In that period, whenever the CPK forces captured an urban center controlled by their enemy, that is the Khmer Republic regime, they forcibly evacuated the population. The CPK's forcible evacuations of urban centers before 1975 were designed to drain the Khmer Republic of any support base and forcibly relocate the evacuated civilian population to CPK-controlled rural cooperatives in the liberated zones, where that population would be enslaved and used as a production base for the revolution. The evacuations were also accompanied by executions. These evacuations were criminal acts directed against thousands of people, undertaken in an organized and coordinated manner, and ordered from the very top of the party. In a speech published in the December 1976, January 1977 Revolutionary Flag magazine, Nuon Chea described a number of pre-1975 forced transfers of civilian populations and explained the party line of seizing the people and drying up the people from the enemy. He wrote that, quote, attacking the enemy politically, taking just one example, fighting to seize the people. Throughout the world, they never fought to seize the people. Our line was to fight to seize the people. 1, we took him. 2, we took them. 100, we took them. 1,000, we took them. And so on until we fought for and seized that people from Phnom Penh through. The line of drying up the people from the enemy was very correct. This never happened in the world. An example, the fighting in Banam in 1973. We took everyone in Banam town, expelling the ethnic Vietnamese, the ethnic Chinese, the military, the police. We took everyone, drying up the people from the enemy. End of quote.
Stephen Hader lived in Phnom Penh from 1973 to early April 1975. He confirmed in his testimony that the phrase drying up the people from the enemy was used frequently in Khmer Rouge radio broadcasts before the fall of Phnom Penh. There is an important parallel between these pre-75 events and the evacuation of the city in April 1975. They were carried out by force and without any regard for the suffering inflicted on the victims. The party center acknowledged this in the July 1973 issue of the Revolutionary Flag, which stated, I quote, for example, in the evacuation of people from the areas under the control of the enemy to the liberated zones, we took strong and optimistic views of mass population to successfully send them away to the countryside with no worry that they could be fraught with difficulty due to the lack of everything. In addition, we were not afraid that people in the liberated areas could not help the evacuated people. With strong popular views, we believed that our people could do everything. Although we were in the situation that we were lack of rice as we are now, we dare to evacuate many more people." Unquote. Your Honors, in other words, the party recognized the inevitable human cost and suffering that would caused by this forced evacuation, and took no steps to minimize that suffering. Human suffering was never a consideration, nor did the party leaders ever reconsider or change their practices in light of the harm being caused. The severe harm inflicted on the civilian populations during the pre-1975 evacuations was illustrated by the testimony of witness Nu Mau. Mr. Mau was a member of a sub-district committee in Nodong district in 1974. He said, and I quote, "At the time, I was living in Cheung Reh commune, Odong district. Then the superior at the upper level told us that we had to receive people from Odong. They captured some soldiers, and then they evacuated some people all the way through Omliang. There was nothing over there. The land was barren. We had nothing to eat but wild potatoes and some wild plants. So there were a lot of casualties. Some people died of starvation. Some died of diseases because they did not have access to medicines." Describing pre-1975 evacuation generally, Nu Mau testified as follows, quote, "At the time, wherever the soldiers arrived, people were evacuated. When they evacuated people, actually they did not, or they were not prepared for the people. People had nothing to eat, so some of them eventually died of starvation, and some disappeared mysteriously. And some barely survived. CPK's treatment of urban populations was inherently violent and discriminatory. Nuon Chea and Khieu Sampon and the other CPK leaders determined that the cities were a natural base for the enemies of the revolution. In a 1978 interview with a Danish delegation, Nuon Chea said that, quote, "The conditions in the cities and the countryside were quite different. In rural areas, living conditions were very bad, but there were few enemies. In the cities, living conditions were better, but there were many enemies." Unquote. In the eyes of the CPK, the people in the cities became the natural political enemy. Professor Chandler testified that, quote, "The people in the cities were by definition enemies. Feudalism and imperialism were located in the eyes of the leaders of the CPK in the cities. The cities were where the bad things were happening." Witness Chuk Rin, the Southwest Zone Khmer Rouge commander to whom I referred earlier, confirmed that as a military man, knew well before 1975 that people who occupied the cities were enemies. The CPK indoctrinated its cadres and members of the military that the city were riddled with moral turpitude and filth, and that they were inhabited by the enemy. Describing this ideological delineation, Philip Short wrote, quote, "Soldiers were urged to cut off their hearts towards potential enemies, a category which included all urban deportees." End quote. He expanded on this in his testimony before the chamber, stating that, quote, "It's consistent with everything we have been describing about the ends justifying the means, making a clear line of demarcation between the enemy and ourselves, about those who chose to vote with their feet and stay in the cities rather than joining the revolution being untrustworthy." End quote. This discriminatory treatment of the urban population is a theme to which I will be returning throughout my remaining submissions. It is essential to understanding the criminal intent behind CPK's forced evacuations of urban areas, and especially the evacuation in April 1975. In September 1973, the Khmer Rouge forces captured a part of the provincial town of Kampong Cham and immediately proceeded to forcibly transfer some 15,000 people into areas controlled by them. Stephen Hadder visited Kampong Cham and interviewed people there after the Khmer Republic forces reasserted control of the town. His interviewees reported that people had been evacuated by the Khmer Rouge to the west and that some were killed on the spot. Mr. Hadder also testified that he learned from his interviewees that those executed were the Khmer Republic, civil servants, and military personnel in particular. Kai Pok, the Deputy North Zone Secretary, confirmed in his autobiography, which has been placed on the case file, that he and his superior Koi Thuan coordinated the attack on Kampong Cham under the orders of the Central Committee. François Ponceau, who lived in Cambodia until April 1975, confirmed the 1973 forced evacuation of Kampong Cham in his OCIJ statement. He also testified to the Khmer Rouge forced evacuation of Bos Knau, which is in the vicinity of Kampong Cham. He said the following, I quote, "We know very well that when the Khmer Rouge soldiers capture a village, then the houses in the village would be set on fire. The commune chief would be executed, and people would be evacuated to the forest. People were evacuated, and when the heads of the groups were killed. And this thing is not new. That happened already since 1973, and this was well known to everyone." End quote. Your Honors have also heard expert and eyewitness evidence of the mass forced evacuation of the city of Adong in March 1974. This forced evacuation was a seminal event, and it occurred at a time when the CPK forces were closing in on Phnom Penh and when the fall of the Khmer Republic was only a matter of time. The forced evacuation of Dong became the template which the CPK Party Center decided was to be followed in the case of Phnom Penh. When asked about the significance of the forced evacuation of Dong, Professor Chandler testified that, quote, in 1975, it seems to us, observers of Cambodia, that this was an unprecedented move. We now find from things that came to light after 1975, documents, and so on, that this had been predicted, if you like, both in Takeo and in Odong, but also in the town of Krati, which was also evacuated, when the Khmer Rouge took it over and Stung Train to the further north. End quote. The Khmer Rouge forces from the southwest and north zones overran Odong on the 18th of March 1974. The attack was coordinated by Son Sen, the Chief of General Staff and a member of the Central Committee. As in Kampong Cham, Kai Pok was a direct participant in the attack on Odong. As soon as the city of Odong fell, it was forcibly evacuated by the Khmer Rouge troops, who herded some 20,000 people out of the city while executing scores of Khmer Republic soldiers. In his testimony, Philip Short confirmed the following vivid and compelling description of the event, which was based on his interviews of eyewitnesses. I quote, "Several thousand government soldiers and civilian refugees were massacred. It was said afterwards that many turned their guns on their own families before killing themselves to avoid capture and torture." The population of that town, some 20,000 people, were rounded up and marched to the forest of Pahel before being resettled in cooperatives in the special zone and the southwest. Officials and uniformed soldiers were separated from the rest, led away, and killed. Unquote. The direct consequences of the attack were witnessed by Stephen Hader, who traveled to Odong shortly afterwards. He described the city as being virtually empty. Witnesses Mr. Hader interviewed on that day told him that, quote, "The Khmer Rouge troops who had entered Odong killed certain people and took most, if not all, of the rest of the population out to the countryside." Unquote. Mr. Hader also clarified that the categories of people who suffered were Khmer Republic, civil servants, and military personnel in particular. The execution of Khmer Republic officials in Odong was, according to Philip Short, consistent with what had been happening before and with, of course, what happened afterwards. This is all compelling evidence of the CPK's entrenched policies of forced transfer and the systematic targeting and murder of Khmer Republic officials. This evidence refutes all defense assertions to the contrary. In a speech given in North Korea in early April 1974, Khieu Samphan proudly endorsed the annihilation of Odong. boasting to the international media present that, quote, on 18 March, our People's National Liberation Armed Forces liberated another city, Odong, by annihilating all the puppet soldiers there along with their reinforcement. In other words, over 5,000 enemies were eliminated, 1,500 of whom were captured. Unquote. Witness Nu Mau also confirmed that local communes celebrated the success of the evacuation and the movement of the population to the jungle. The evacuation of Adong is also confirmed by the evidence of witness Romchun Ton, alias Pipun, Pol Pot's aide, who traveled through the area approximately 1 week after the evacuation and saw that the city was empty. This is what he said in his evidence. Quote, when I entered the area, it was very quiet. There was no one. Mainly to the west of the river, that is the way to Omleang or Tropeng Cho or Ral. They went that way. So they evacuated from the town center and they spread to the nearby villages and assembled on the way. Unquote. Like Nu Mau, Pipun participated in meetings at which the evacuation of Adong was declared to be a good example. He was told by these accused this example would be followed when Phnom Penh is occupied by the Khmer Rouge. Pipun was then asked how it was he knew this information. He said the following, quote, as I stated earlier this morning, I learned it through his presentation at each study session. Either Nuon Chea, Pol Pot, or Khieu Samphan presented this idea to us, and that was the experience they learned. And they were good experiences, and we should draw the good point from it in order to finally liberate Phnom Penh. And that is how I learned it. End quote. In my opening remarks, I refer to the Party Center meetings in June 1974 and April 1975, at which the leaders resolved to forcibly evacuate Phnom Penh upon victory. The forced evacuation of Adong was discussed at both of those meetings. The accused Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan were present at both meetings and took part in the decision to evacuate the cities. My colleague will deal with these meetings in detail when he addresses Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan's liability for the crimes. As I discussed earlier, the forced evacuation of urban centers by the CPK prior to 1975 are crucial to an understanding of the criminal intent underlying the forced evacuation of Phnom Penh. Even cadres several levels below the leaders knew of the forced evacuation of other cities. Even they knew that Phnom Penh would be evacuated upon victory. This is illustrated well in the evidence before you. In his testimony before the chamber, Stephen Hader confirmed the following statement given to him by a CPK cadre named Lon Aka Lon, a member of the Kampong Sound Standing Committee. I quote, "If we had captured Phnom Penh in 1974, it would also have been an evacuation. This had been a long-standing plan. Slogan verse, dry up the people from the enemy." Unquote. In his 1977 speech, Nuon Chea used this very phrase, drying up the people from the enemy. Another witness to whom I referred earlier, the Sector 13 cadre interviewed by Stephen Hader, confirmed that the evacuation of the cities were a long-standing practice of the Khmer Rouge, and he stated the following, quote, "I feel that the plan to evacuate Phnom Penh was part of a general long-standing policy because that was what we had always done before when we liberated an enemy zone." End quote. Nu Mau described meetings in the Southwest Zone at which Tamok, the secretary of the Southwest Zone and a member of the Communist Party of Cambodia Standing Committee, and Chu Chet Eliasi, member of the CPK Central Committee, debated the plan to evacuate Phnom Penh upon victory. Nu Mau confirmed that he attended another meeting in 1974 at which Hu Jun spoke out against the planned evacuation and at which he learned that Khieu Samphan was in favor of it. At that time, Nu Mau was a mere member of a commune committee, and yet he was appraised of the party's plan to evacuate all cities. Francois Ponceau has testified that the evacuation was part of a systematic Khmer Rouge policy. In his statement before OCIJ, he said, quote, "I believe that the decision to evacuate was part of a systematic policy by the Khmer Rouge, who had already evacuated all the towns or villages they had previously occupied." End quote. Your Honors, we submit that this evidence alone established that Khieu Samphan is lying when he says that he had no knowledge whatsoever of the plan to evacuate Phnom Penh. At this point, I will address the specific reasons for the evacuation of Phnom Penh. At paragraph 12 of his closing brief, Nuon Chea stated that the purpose of the evacuation was to implement an economic policy that under the extraordinary circumstances in which Cambodia found itself in 1975, Nuon Chea genuinely believed was in the best interest of the Cambodian people. If that was his belief, why has he chosen not to explain that belief in this courtroom? He also argues that the evacuation was necessary in light of the dire humanitarian conditions in Cambodia in April 1975, as well as what he describes as a withdrawal of humanitarian aid just days prior to the liberation. Your Honors, these claims have absolutely no basis in reality. We will expose them for what they are: dishonest, deceitful, self-serving assertion designed to mislead this chamber and to justify crimes of enormous proportions and to shield Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan from their criminal responsibility. The decision of the CPK leaders to evacuate Phnom Penh and all other cities in Cambodia had absolutely nothing to do with addressing a genuine humanitarian crisis. It was an inherently punitive act directed at the people whom the CPK leaders view as their real or potential enemy. The evacuations were designed to suppress, subjugate, and punish the upburn population, to identify within that population those who qualified for immediate execution, and to enslave those who survive so they can be stripped of their rights. The President, Madam Prosecutor, please hold on because we need to change and replace the audio cassette. The President, you may resume, Madam Prosecutor. Madam Prosecutor, thank you, Mr. President. I shall resume now. The evacuation were designed to suppress, subjugate, and punish the upburn population, to identify within that population those who qualify for immediate execution, and to enslave those who survive, so they can be stripped of all their rights and turned into mere objects subsisting under the CPK's rule of terror. They were about enforcing the CPK rule and protecting their leaders, including these accused, from any real or perceived enemies. These evacuations were therefore about power. They were about punishment. The evacuations were about Nuon Chea, Khieu Samphan, and the other party center members eliminating people they label as enemies. They have said so by their own admission. In a September 1973 speech, Pol Pot said that the victory was due to the smashing of all sorts of enemy organizations. Nuon Chea admitted in a 1978 interview in relation to the supposed USA, KGB or CIA plan that, quote, "We smashed the plan immediately after liberation. We evacuated the cities." End quote. In recent interview, Khieu Samphan also sought to justify the evacuation as necessary to avert the threat of a rebellion by CIA and Khmer Republic agents, which would have supposedly enabled the Vietnamese to invade. I quote, "And if, in addition, there was incitement by the CIA, more rebels, and the remnants of the Lon Nol army throughout Phnom Penh and the countryside, there would be rebellion." End quote. In the July 1975 issue of the Revolutionary Youth magazine confirms that the CPK leadership carried out the forced evacuation in order to deal with enemy that might have attacked the party. Similarly, Philip Short testified that the policy reason for the evacuation included, quote, "breaking up the network among city dwellers so that they were no longer in the position to resist the regime." End quote. The April 1975 evacuations were also designed to destroy and eliminate CPK's class enemies. The CPK document entitled "Third Year Anniversary of the Organization of the Peasants' Cooperatives" asserts that the evacuations attacked and demolished the feudal landowner class capitalists in cities. Members of the former Khmer Republic regime were marked for immediate elimination. The rest of the population was to be suppressed and imprisoned in CPK cooperatives. Many were executed. The rest were subjected to systematic physical and psychological abuse, including being forced to write biographies so that the remnants of the Khmer Republic regime could be identified and eliminated, being denied freedom of movement and security of person, being separated from their families and forced to perform hard manual labor, being subjected to starvation rations, and denied the right to feed themselves or forage for food, being subjected to threats, torture, and detention in security centers. Evacuees were executed for showing capitalist tendencies, failing to comply with orders, objecting to oppressive treatment, or even falling ill. In summary, all upburn evacuees who survived the first wave of identification and elimination of enemies were subjected to a regime of persecution and terror. The systematic persecution against the upburn evacuees were reflected in their labeling as New People or 17 April people. Within the New World Order, the CPK put in place on 17 April 1975, all new people were classified as depositees or parasites. Denis Afonso, a French national, testified before this court that in April 1975, following her evacuation from Phnom Penh to Koh Tukville, she, her family, and all other evacuees on this island had to attend a meeting in a pagoda where a Khmer Rouge representative stated, quote, "You are now our prisoners. We are not going to simply point a gun at you and shoot you. We are going to have you work for us, and we are going to kill you otherwise." End quote. That is what we were told, literally, the word that I will never forget. Denis Afonso also confirmed that from the day of the evacuation, it was made crystal clear that the evacuees were the property of Angkar. This institutionalized their persecution and ensure that they were treated differently from those whom the CPK deemed loyal to its cause. During his testimony, Professor Chandler was asked to expand on the reason for the creation of the depositee group. He stated, quote, "I think the purpose seems fairly obvious. It is to again separate the clean Cambodians from the dirty Cambodians. And the dirty ones are the ones who have been sent out, exiled, and was called Pnyal." In his testimony, Stephen Hader confirmed a passage from his book, The 7 Candidates for Prosecution, in which he analyzed the three-tier categorization of the population under CPK rule and confirmed that depositees were last on distribution lists, first on execution lists, and had no political rights. Philip Short confirmed the treatment of the upburn population in April 1975. He said that, quote, different leaders with a different ideology might have chosen a policy of national reconciliation. Pol Pot decided otherwise. To him, the city dwellers and the peasant who had fled to join them in the dying months of the war were ipso facto collaborators and had to be dealt with as such. End quote. Mr. Short also said in his testimony, and I quote, I would simply say it's consistent with everything we have been describing about the ends justifying the means, about making a clear line of demarcation between the enemy and ourselves, about those who choose to vote with their feet and stay in the cities rather than joining the revolution being untrustworthy. Unquote. In one of his books, Professor Chandler described the evacuation decision as a brutal order and stressed the persecutory intent on the part of the CPK leaders. He wrote, quote, this brutal order, never thoroughly explained, added several thousand deaths to the approximately 500,000 in the Civil War. Perhaps the overriding reason, however, was the desire to assert the victory of the CPK, the dominance of the countryside over the cities, and the privileged position of the poor. Solotso and his colleagues had not spent 7 years in the forest and 5 years fighting a civil war to take office as city councillors. Unquote. To demonstrate the CPK's leaders' intent to suppress and subjugate the upburn population, I will read from one of their own publications. This is a passage from the August 1975 Revolutionary Flag magazine, which, as Nguyen Chi acknowledges, was a document produced by the party center. Quote, now the colonialists and imperialists have been overthrown. The landowners and the feudalists have been overthrown. The capitalists have been overthrown, and the petty bourgeoisie has no one to rely upon. Therefore, they are subjugated to the state power of the worker peasants. Their class has been overthrown. Their economic foundations have been overthrown, but their outlook and their desires remain the same. Therefore, they continue to be in conflict with the revolution, unquote. So even after the upburn classes were overthrown and subjugated to CPK rule, in the eyes of the leaders, they continue to be in conflict with the revolution, and therefore they were deserving of punitive treatment. Now, I wish to review the evidence that deals with the condition in Phnom Penh in the months preceding evacuation. This evidence is relevant because it further refutes the defense argument that the evacuations were ordered to feed the people and to respond to a humanitarian crisis. The evidence shows that in the months leading to the fall of Phnom Penh, the CPK leadership deliberately caused a humanitarian crisis in Phnom Penh, placing the city under siege, blocking the delivery of food and medical supplies, killing civilians in shelling raids on residential areas, and terrorizing the capital's entire civilian population. These actions are entirely inconsistent with any intent on the part of the accused to avoid or reduce suffering. They show that the intention of the accused were in fact the exact opposite. The final offensive against Phnom Penh was announced by Khieu Samphan in a statement broadcast on the Khmer Rouge radio at 11 a.m. on the 31st of August 1974. In the statement, Khieu Samphan noted that the area around Phnom Penh, under the control of the Khmer Republic, had been reduced to 10 square kilometers and was under constant siege by the Khmer Rouge troops. Khieu Samphan noted that food supplies in the capital had become scarce and that the city's only hope for the delivery of aid was the Mekong River. He boasted how Khmer Rouge troops were already launching heavy attacks on various enemy positions along the waterway, causing worse difficulties to the transportation of U.S. imperialist aid to Phnom Penh. He then called on the troops to launch the most vigorous and most powerful offensive against the enemy around Phnom Penh and in Phnom Penh and at various provincial capitals. The offensive began on the 1st of January 1975 with the CPK forces firing rockets into the city of Phnom Penh. The evidence demonstrates that in the period between the 1st of January and the 17th of April, the Khmer Rouge forces tightened their grip on the city, deliberately causing a dire humanitarian situation. The radio broadcast by the Khmer Rouge and the Khmer Republic government, which were recorded and transcribed by the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, (FIBIS), provided a compelling day-by-day account of the deteriorating situation in Phnom Penh. As described in those broadcasts as well as in the diary and testimony of Sidney Schanberg, in order to effectively strangle the city, the Khmer Rouge carried out attacks on convoys which were attempting to deliver food and fuel supplies to Phnom Penh up the Mekong River from South Vietnam. By early February 1975, the Khmer Rouge had laid floating mines in the Mekong to prevent any aid from reaching the city. A 9 February 1975 article by Sidney Schanberg reported that the Khmer Rouge fire and mines had destroyed 19 delivery ships which were attempting to supply aid to the capital. These events were confirmed by Mr. Schanberg in his testimony. By early February, the Mekong waterway was completely closed leaving the capital entirely dependent on an airlift. However, the Khmer Rouge proceeded to shell the Pochentong airport and civilian planes flying much needed aid into the city. Another fact recorded in Phoebus, in Sidney Schanberg's contemporaneous articles, his diary and his testimony before the chamber. Describing the effect of the shelling of the airport, Mr. Schanberg testified, quote, "It reduced the amount of supplies, and as the insurgent, the Khmer Rouge assault continued, less and less food and other needs, fuel, was getting in. And that is all it was. It was like a noose tightening around the city," unquote. The same treatment, strangulation by siege, shelling, terrorizing of a civilian population, was meted out to the population of Nhat Luang, the town located south of Phnom Penh. Nhat Luang was overrun by the Khmer Rouge on the 1st of April 1975. Throughout these months, CPK leaders made absolutely no allowance for food and medical supplies to be brought in to help the civilian population, which was not taking part in any hostilities. The bad living conditions caused by the siege was made significantly worse by the Khmer Rouge shelling of residential areas of the city. Throughout the January to the 17 April period, CPK forces regularly and indiscriminately fire rockets into residential areas of Phnom Penh, killing and wounding hundreds of civilians and inflicting terror on the city's population. These attacks were reported extensively in Phoebus, January, February, March, and April 1975. They are also reported in witness testimonies and other written records. For example, both Phoebus and Sidney Schanberg's diary describe how a Khmer Rouge rocket hit a primary school in Phnom Penh on the 6th of February 1975, killing and wounding numerous young children. The Khmer Republic government sought negotiations with the Khmer Rouge for a peaceful end to the war, negotiation which the CPK leadership rejected explicitly on numerous occasions. For example, on the 8th of April 1975, statement by Khieu Samphan responded to unconfirmed reports of negotiations between the Khmer Rouge and the Khmer Republic government. I quote, "According to some Western sources, a few days ago, the contemptible Long Boret said that there was a contact for negotiation with the other side. As they have previously done on several occasions, the NUFC and RGNUC would like to make it clear again to national and international opinion that they have absolutely never negotiated with, nor will they ever accept negotiation with the traitorous clique, unquote. Another illustrative example of the terror being inflicted by the Khmer Rouge forces on the civilian population of Phnom Penh is recorded in Mr. Schanberg's diary in the entry for the 3rd of March 1975. Quote, "A rocket lands on the capital's busiest downtown street in front of the Norum Hotel. 5 people were killed immediately and 8 others lie wounded. The street is strewn with bodies and pieces of bodies. Such slaughterhouse spectacles have become everyday scenes here," unquote. Two days later, Sidney Schanberg noted that in the 9 weeks since the offensive began, about 1,000 rockets have fallen on the capital, killing more than 150 civilians and wounding nearly 600 others. Stephen Hader, who, like Sidney Schanberg, lived in Phnom Penh in this period, also described CPK shelling of the capital from late 1974 to April 1975. He had to dig a bunker under his house and sometimes had to live in the bunker due to regular Khmer Rouge shelling of the part of the city in which he was living. Hader testified that the CPK artillery and rocket fire fell primarily in residential areas. He also described an incident in which a whole neighborhood went up in flames, unquote. As confirmed by expert witness Philip Short, the shelling of residential areas reflected the Khmer Rouge leaders' view that it was acceptable to inflict harm on the population, which had sought refuge in the city. Mr. Philip Short says, I quote, "The shelling attacks were basically psychological warfare. They were to show that the Lonal regime was incapable of defending anybody. But the fact that the shelling was indiscriminate and therefore, given the range of the artillery, was going to fall very often on the poorer suburbs. That was acceptable because those people had chosen to be with Lonal rather than staying with the revolutionaries. So the two went together." The statements on the Khmer Rouge radio, both by leaders such as Khieu Samphan and by the Khmer Rouge information agencies, confirmed the leaders' approval of shelling of the city and the blockage of humanitarian aid. As early as September 1974, the Revolutionary Youth magazine confirmed that the Khmer Rouge forces were shelling Phnom Penh. Now I will read two related extracts. First, referring to counter-offensive by the Khmer Republic forces, the circular states, quote, "They wanted to push us away from the Phnom Penh entrances so that we would not be able to fire rockets into Phnom Penh anymore," unquote. Then, on the next page, the circular boasts, quote, "On the contrary, we still keep our position firmly around Phnom Penh and are able to fire rockets at will into Phnom Penh from any direction, even into the Pochentong airport," unquote. Moving forward in time, on the 19th of February 1975, Khmer Rouge radio broadcast boasted about the closure of the Mekong waterway. Quote, "Since the beginning of February, no enemy river convoy has been able to sail through our gauntlet on Mekong River. Thus, the Mekong River, blocked in January and early February, will be forever cut. And this means that the enemy will be deprived of his rice and fuel supplies forever. Consequently, the already deteriorating situation in Phnom Penh will become even worse," unquote. A 5th of March 1975 Khmer Rouge broadcast stated that, quote, "The enemy is now in agony because the Mekong River has been cut for 2 months and the air route and all other communication routes will be completely cut off in the very near future," unquote. In this period, Khieu Samphan made a number of statements over the Khmer Rouge radio addressed to the Khmer Rouge troops and to the population of Phnom Penh. My colleague will be referring to those statements in more detail. I will read from just two. First, a 24th February statement by Khieu Samphan, quote, "Phnom Penh is subject to our forces' most active artillery attacks. Worse still, the Mekong route, which is the sole vital transportation route left to the enemy for transporting supplies to Phnom Penh, is now completely cut. Thus, in Phnom Penh and other empty-held provincial capital, the shortage of rice, which has always been extremely scarce, will become even more acute in the future." And secondly, an excerpt from a 22nd of March 1975 statement by Khieu Samphan, I quote, "We have blocked almost all of the transportation routes of the enemy. The Mekong is blocked, all overland routes are cut, and Pochentong is subject to our constant shelling attacks," unquote. The President: "Thank you, Madam Prosecutor. The time is now appropriate for lunch adjournment. The Chamber will adjourn now and resume at 1:15 this afternoon. This is the notice for parties and information for members of the public who are following the proceedings. Security guards are now instructed to bring Mr. Khieu Samphan down to the holding cell and have him return to this courtroom by 1:15.